Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we start our panel? We're now 15 minutes late. We've had the dubious experience of losing 2 people so far, which gives us a little more time. So we're not as pressed, but we still have a lot of ground to cover. My name is Walter Reich. There's a description of everybody, including everybody on the panel itself, all of the panelists, and this green sheet. Does everybody have these green sheets? So I won't read everything on it. And a description of me, too, so I don't have to explain myself. I just want to begin by saying that I wish that General Sutton had some years ago given me that brain coin that she gave to Sonia Michelle, because I was then in a uniformed service, one that most of you probably haven't heard of, called the United States Public Health Service. Our uniforms were, and I had the rank, the equivalent of a Navy captain, and didn't have enough ribbons or medals. And I certainly would have petitioned my boss, who was the U.S. Surgeon General, to ask if I would be permitted to put on a brain coin to make it look better, or at least more impressive. But those days are over. I did have the opportunity, I should say, to spend 4 years at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences as the Public Health Service Professor of Psychiatry. I'm a physician. And had the opportunity then to interact with members of the military, with doctors and with their patients, and with the military culture, not to the extent that somebody would who's actually in a military service, but got to really have serious exposure to and great respect for that culture, so much of which is being reflected in this in these discussions. The session that we're dealing with now is called Treatment of Physical Wounds, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and Traumatic Brain Injuries. Physical injuries often require long periods of recuperation and rehabilitation, which not only disrupt soldiers' lives, but place new burdens on their families, and often result in long-term disabilities that affect a service member's ability to function in the civilian sector, whether as employees or as family members. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and traumatic brain injuries present additional and different challenges. Symptoms may not appear until months or even years after deployment, but their consequences can be devastating. There are increased rates of suicide, substance abuse, domestic violence, unemployment, homelessness. All of these have been linked to service in combat zones. So what advances have been made in the treatment of common battlefield injuries? Are they being implemented in the military? Have they been incorporated into civilian institutions such as hospitals and medical schools? Our panel will help us deal with these questions. We've decided, for a variety of thematic reasons, to rearrange the order that is presented here on this blue sheet. The first one to speak will be Loree Manning, who's Director of Women in the Military Project, Women's Research and Education Institute. Second one will be Renee Bardorf, who, despite the missing E, is a...
Linda will go next.
Oh. Linda. Linda Davis is former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense of Military Community and Family Policy. And did we change our plans? No, I must have written it down wrong. And Renee Bardorf is Executive Director of Remind, and she'll explain what Remind is.
I'm going to be a stander-upper.
Okay.
Good morning. It's great to be here with you today. And I think I should add before I speak that I have no medical credentials other than a stint as a nurse's aide when I was in college, nor any academic credentials. I am a retired Navy captain, so it's my military experience that led to my current job, which deals specifically with women in the military. And the official title of my talk this morning is What We Know About Military Women Who Suffer from PTSD, especially combat-related PTSD, and the implications for their spouses and children. Now, if I had announced that title even 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, to a group like you, it would have startled the daylights out of people. Women with combat-related PTSD and the impacts on their children. So I want to talk about how we got to the point where 15 years ago that was not something anybody would have been talking about, and today where it comes up quite often. During our 20th century wars, with the exception of combat nurses, those who fought in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, no military women at that time ever had children. They had children afterwards, but if they were on active duty, they were not the parent of a child or the guardian of a child or even married to somebody with a child who spent more than 30 days a year in the household. Because if they were, out they went. Also, with the exception of the combat nurses, American women were usually kept very far away from anything that looked like a combat zone. A few did deploy to Vietnam, but it was rare that they would be anywhere near where a gun was fired. And it was only 11 years ago, 12 years ago, I guess now, that we even had our first women participate in combat operations. That was the women pilots who flew as part of Operation Desert Fox, which was the no-fly zone, enforcing the no-fly zone in Iraq in the late 90s. So before our current war, while wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, while it wouldn't have been absolutely unheard of to hear about a woman with combat-related PTSD, she would have been a rare avis indeed. Yet here we are today to discuss just that issue. So how did this happen? Well, the seeds were planted in the 1970s with the changes in the military brought about by the expiration of the draft and the feminist movement, which impacted not only the military, but every major institution in the country. And one of the speakers from the last panel has very elegantly talked about some of the demographic changes and changes in families, the numbers of families and things that the draft brought about. And I was going to get into that a bit, but since she did such an elegant job, I will skip it and jumped right to women with families. As I've already said, before the 1970s, if a woman had a child, she was gone. She could have a husband. And it was not until the 70s, by the way, that she was able to get the so-called spousal benefits for those husbands. And it took a Supreme Court case to do that. But have a kid, even marry a guy who had a 17-year-old who came to visit for a month in the summer, and you were out. But in the 70s, partly because of the expiration of the draft, partly because of a lot of societal changes, over the course of a very long time, the services began to change their policies about military mothers. And by the end of the 70s, all the services allowed women who had children to stay on active duty and sometimes required them to stay on active duty. In 1972, when the draft expired, less than 2% of those serving in the military were women. Today, between 14 and 15% are, and 19% of the Air Force is female, and 24% of the Army Reserve is female. We just began recruiting more women, and it came about pretty much simultaneously with the changing policies on motherhood. And as we recruited more women, we began to put them in more jobs and more units. So over the course of the 70s and the 80s, what was once a very small and junior female force had grown into a considerable part of the military, and these women were not junior anymore. Many of them were in the senior enlisted grades. They were warrant officers. They had reached the ranks of generals and admirals. They were commanding things. It would have been impossible to abstract them. And they had also been continually gaining the kinds of jobs they had access to, including in the 70s. That is when we opened up non-combatant ships, non-combatant aircraft, and of course the service academies to women. And as they proved they could do things, more continued to open, which meant we recruited yet more women. Thus, the all-volunteer force that fought the 1991 Gulf War differed demographically from the draft force which fought the Vietnam War. It was older, it was more female, 11 or 12% at that time. There were many more young parents of both sexes, including dual military couples with children and single custodial parents of both sexes. For the first time in our history, we deployed a large number of women, 4,782 to be exact, to a war zone. And these women participated in many operations, some dangerous. 13 were killed, including the first American enlisted women killed by hostile fire. But the women's participation in the Gulf War stopped short of actual combat. These deployed women performed very well, and so afterwards, Congress changed the law which had kept them out of aviation and sea combat. In other words, we opened up combatant ships to women and air crew service, either as a pilot or an air crew member of aircraft with combatant missions. So that was a big change after the Gulf War, and it sets the stage for some of the things we're seeing today in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, only ground combat occupations, that is infantry, armor, long-range field artillery, ground combat units, at least technically, and special forces, and again I would say at least technically, remain closed to women. Since the start of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, over 240,000 women, that's about 10 or 11% of the force at any given time, have deployed to the war zones. And this includes, as with the men, many who have deployed multiple times. Over 600 of these women have been wounded. About 125 have been killed, and about 70% of these were killed by hostile fire, the most that we have ever lost of women to hostile fire in any of our wars. And the exposure of large numbers of women, military women, to the stresses of long-term and repeat service in a war zone, including the exposure of some to hostile fire and actual ground combat, is something we have not seen on this scale before. I mentioned earlier that women remain barred from ground combat occupations, and in the Army they can't be assigned to ground combat units. Yet everyone who follows the news knows that women are finding themselves in ground combat. And ground combat itself, interestingly enough, by policy, is not closed to women. It's just the occupations in the units. And there are two reasons for this, of course. One is the sheer nature of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their asymmetric guerrilla. Being in the war zone can mean you'll find yourself in combat. And the second reason is that although women can't be assigned, that is, ordered by their service's headquarters to a permanent duty station in a ground combat arms unit, they can be attached to such units by the local on-the-ground commander when it's operationally necessary. And it's often operationally necessary. For instance, if an infantry unit is going out on combat patrol and the only available medic is a woman, you can bet she's going to go with them. It's necessary that she go with them. Thus, a lot of women have found themselves in firefights, ambushes, attacked by IEDs, mortars, They've been shot at, and unlike their sister soldiers in previous wars, they are trained and equipped to shoot back and kill, which can bring its own set of stressors to both men and women. Some of these women, like their male counterparts, have been diagnosed with combat-related PTSD, and some, because their service records too often don't have the documentation of their attachment to ground combat units, find it harder than their male counterparts to prove when they become veterans and are appearing before VA boards that their PTSD is in fact combat-related. There are many studies underway within the Department of Defense, within the Bureau, within the Department of Veterans Affairs, and at many other institutions like Purdue and other academic places, looking at the effects of PTSD on our serving soldiers. And when I read these studies, one of the things I always have to remind myself, and it's probably not a problem with this particular audience, but a lot of people tend to conflate active duty, veterans who use VA, and veterans who don't use VA. But when you're looking at the studies, it's important to understand what group is being considered. Is it a study looking at active duty soldiers? Is it looking at veterans who use VA health services? Now, veterans, I think this is pretty basic, but those are people who are no longer on active duty, is how I'm using that word. Are they the ones who use VA health services? And for women, VA tells me about 45% of the women who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan who are veterans use their health services, which means in that third group, 55% of the women veterans do not use VA health services, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. But when you're looking at these studies, check and see which group is being talked about, because usually it's only one of those groups. Sometimes it's active duty and veterans who used VA. Occasionally, but not too rarely, it's all the above. It's the active duty, the VA users, and the non-VA users. It's harder to find the non-VA using veterans. You sort of have to randomly dial on the telephone sometimes. Just finding your sample can be difficult. But it does matter. One recent study that has looked at all three categories, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with it, is the 2008 RAND study called Invisible Wounds of War, Psychological and Cognitive Injuries, the PTSD and TBI, traumatic brain injuries, and services to assist recovery. About 11.5% of those interviewed for this study were women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the study's findings, RAND researchers estimated that about 14% of those who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan may have PTSD or major depression, and about 2/3 of that number probably have both. They also found out that certain groups of service personnel, Army and Marine Corps members, that's because they've borne the brunt of the fighting, women, enlisted troops, for example, had a somewhat higher propensity to exhibit symptoms of PTSD and or major depression. And this study is the most comprehensive look I've seen at PTSD in the people fighting the current wars. There may be something else out there that I've missed, though, and I'd like to hear about it if I have missed something. And the other nice thing about the study is it looks at the impact not only on the service members, but it attempts to look at what possible impact having your husband or wife, mother or father come home from the war with PTSD can have on a family. And to try to determine this, the RAND people did the usual review of literature of both PTSD in veterans of previous wars and also PTSD in the civilian population. And not unexpectedly, the review shows that PTSD impairs relationships, disrupts marriages, aggravates the difficulties of parenting, and can cause long-term problems in children. Those with PTSD can have difficulties with emotional regulation, which in men, more so than in women, is a predictor of greater physical violence, and in women, more so than men, is a predictor of a greater tendency toward major depression. PTSD can also, of course, cause difficulty in sustaining employment, which has financial implications for these veterans and their families. The study then goes on, as studies are wont to do, to identify the enormous gaps in our knowledge about the effects of PTSD on military members and their families. And of course, it makes recommendations for thousands and hundreds and millions of more studies. There is especially a lot we don't know about women veterans and PTSD, nor do we know what differences, if any, may exist between men and women who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan in the prevalence of PTSD and the symptoms they manifest, the preferred treatment options, and the impact on their family members. We don't know if it matters if the military women's PTSD is rooted in combat-related issues or results from military sexual trauma, or sometimes both. Does the impact of a parent's PTSD differ in children or children at certain ages if it's their father or their mother who is exhibiting the PTSD? Do the spouses of male members of the military handle PTSD differently than the spouses of female members of the military? We don't know. And those are just a few of the questions that come up, but we don't have any definitive answers on yet. Some help may be on the way. I'm sure most of you realize that last week both houses of Congress passed the Caregivers and Veterans Omnibus Health Services Bill. And one of the many, many provisions in that bill requires the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to commission an independent study that is not done by VA or the government to look specifically at the health issues of the women veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Women have been a sliver in most previous studies, and they usually don't have enough women in any of those studies to do the kinds of analysis and retrogression analysis you might want to do to learn not only about women in general, but different segments of the women military population. So this may be a first step for us to begin to gather more data specifically looking about women and PTSD. And that's all I have to say, and thank you. One thing I would add, we put out, for those of you who might be interested in military women, my organization, a booklet called Women in the Military, Where They Stand. If you're interested in getting a copy, I can provide one for you for free if you'll just shoot me an email. And if you're interested in that, you can come up and see me later, and I'll tell you what my email address is. So thank you.
Thank you. Linda?
Thank you very much. Thanks for being flexible here. It's a pleasure to be here. Sonia, thank you for the invitation. Chuck, thank you for your sponsorship of this special opportunity to speak amongst peers and new friends, as Loree said, about a very important issue. While we're speaking in general about the impact of the families who also serve, our particular panel is looking at the advances in treatment, the adoptions with the military, and incorporation of the MIL-CIV. So I'll try to address a little of that. I thought Loree followed the other panel very, very well in terms of the history of women in the military and then also getting into the PTSD. I have had the honor of serving as a soldier. My son is a soldier. My service was during the Gulf War, and I came fully equipped into the military in midlife with my own PTSD, carrying it with me. So I didn't have to pick it up in the service, but it presented its own challenges during my military service and the rest of my life. I'd like to outline my presentation in three different areas, four actually. What challenges we saw when I was not only during the last 6 years able to work on the defense women in the military service, the DCoE committee, but also serve in the Navy and the as the lead for the reform of care for wounded warriors after the Walter Reed housing challenges in '07, and then later as the head of the Military Community and Family Policy. I'd like to talk about what we saw very briefly, why we cared, what we did, and what needs to be done, and weave into those one of the overarching issues that I think this group is trying to address, and that is kind of what do we need to do in terms of creating the platforms for collaboration, and where can we achieve greater synergy between the military and the civilian sector. What we saw, we did a very extensive Lean Six Sigma analysis when we began to look in '07 with our mental health task forces and others before even Dole Shalala. We began to look at the care system, and we knew it was not working correctly. I come out of a treatment, being a therapist in a community mental health background, and really the Pentagon was not connected to the communities in the way that we are now, thanks to groups like Renee's Remind, and she'll have a chance to tell you about that. We saw with our analysis that at the point at which a service member and their family was, let's say, after a wound, illness, or injury, they were in a military treatment facility, that just in that period alone, they were seeing 34 case managers, not the providers, not the doctors, just the case managers, and they could be receiving up to 36 different services from those people. To imagine the impact of trying to cope with that when you're trying to exist and live in a hospital for a year, with family separations and challenges to the children and their care and welfare, we knew there was something wrong, and did tend to be very focused on what happened within the DoD and the VA systems. This was particularly true when we looked at people like my friend Juanita. Severe wounds in '05, had returned to the hospital many, many times to Walter Reed, living in Kansas, single parent, one child is autistic. How did she cope with that while she was dealing with her own recovery? And so wounds, illness, and injury, we have learned a lot about the physical treatment of those. And one of the most fascinating things I got to experience was at Launchstool. And on Fridays, they have a telemedicine conference. And around the table will be the docs there at Launchstool, of course, which is the first stop out of theater for the most severely wounded. And they will be talking real time to the docs and the medics in theater at the battalion aid stations, as well as to the folks at the Intrepid Center or the burn folks down in San Antonio. And they'll be talking to people like Dr. Scott down at the Tampa VA Hospital. They're able to discuss the line, the thin blue line of the patient experience across that years out, and able to say, well, you know, when you did the amputation in theater and you cut this particular artery this way at this angle, this close, it had an effect 2 years later on the prosthetics we were able to place on that. So when we address the issues of the MIL-CIV integration and the link between the military and civilian and the DoD and VA, it has improved considerably. It's fascinating, and we're all benefiting from that. But we did see this complex system that from the human experience of the warrior and the family member, that it's very overwhelming. There was a lack of coordination, and that there was no sense of a continuum, and very rarely was the family integrated into the plan for care or their thoughts respected as much as they would like. So knowing that was the situation, that there were people like Juanita very much challenged and her family, we did understand the impact that has, why we cared, because not only was it the impact of our service members who do in fact have a voluntary mission that they themselves want to fulfill, but it also had a tremendous impact socially on them, their extended family, and the population at large. particularly, as Loree mentioned, on the PTSD. We have many men and women who choose not to receive their care from the VA. Oftentimes it's because once they're in veteran status, they have Blue Cross Blue Shield, they have TRICARE, they have other means of caring for themselves than visiting the VA. But some of them are reluctant to go because of ongoing stigma and poor experiences that they have had or lack of access. And we've talked a bit about geographic access. I currently work with 5 women, veterans and about to be veteran status, who have, we'd say, severe PTSD, and not as a clinical nature, but as a somewhat of a coach and a friend, and they're all suffering from the military sexual trauma, and do not want to go to the VA, have had poor experiences. Not that that's typical, but it certainly does occur. And so we have to look at Renee is doing on what groups in the civilian sector are available that can understand the dynamic of the military experience, but still provide the care that's needed in a safe environment. And this is when we get into a few things that are working, the peer-to-peer, informed peer-to-peer support, and supervised does work very well. So we saw the confusion and the complexity of the system. We cared about our service members, and despite what it sometimes seems like and feels like, our military leaders were themselves at one point junior officers or even junior enlisted. Their families have come up through the ranks. They do know and do care about their service members' well-being. We did take some very specific actions to try to coordinate the care better across the continuum from the recovery, the rehabilitation, and into the community reintegration that General Sutton talked about earlier. What we did was boil it down with a statute and instructions in the DoD that now it is law that every serious and severely injured service member and their family in all the services are eligible for 4 particular supports, and they go through a 10-step process to coordinate their care. Those 4 services they get are access to a care coordinator, which is specifically designated to support them and to remain with them for a longer period of time, so there is some continuity in care. They have a recovery plan, which is comprehensive in that it brings into play the family members, their psychological, social, financial, spiritual, educational, transportation, housing. All of those are part of the plan. We did create, building on the theme of collaboration and greater synergy, we created an online national resource directory, a yellow book, that has 10,000 partners integrated into that you can search soon by zip code to identify who can provide what care where, when, and as needed. And the other things that we were able to do is to begin to change, I think, the thinking that there needs to be some standards of care and consistent best practices across the services. We had a summit sponsored by Secretary Gates that I facilitated in 2008, and it was just to look at that consistent best practices. And what we heard from the service members, there was an example, a good question asked about, well, isn't it true that the policy after a service member dies is that the children in the family have to leave the DoD schools and have to move off base? And by hearing the families firsthand, hearing from people like, Kathy and Christina and Molly and Joyce and you all, we were able to change within a week with the Secretary's designation, that policy, so now family members and kids can stay on base until they choose to leave after the death of a loved one. What needs to be done still in terms of the good work that Renee and the Woodruff Foundation have done in terms of traumatic brain injury, we need to bring that in and make it more available with baseline assessments that are done for every single individual. I know they are working on some research on things like the hyperbaric oxygen and the HBOT treatment. We need to be flexible in the DoD to look at protocols that are maybe not yet standard practice out of NIH, but be open to that. I had the opportunity earlier this week to go to the Wounded Warrior Project celebration of that caregiver legislation that Loree mentioned. And Ted Wade was able to stand up there and to talk for an extended period of time, 5 minutes for Ted, clearly, passionately, and Ted was basically in launch stool, and they were discussing the removal of all of his life support because he was expected to be a vegetable when he was injured before '05. Now, TBI, there is tremendous strides that have begun. People are recovering and making substantial improvements, and we need to do a lot better job with sharing that with military civilian. Just quickly, I'd like to touch on some things I think that I hear from my peeps that need to be done. Concurrent treatment for both TBI and PTSD together. Oftentimes we look at them separately. Juanita first gets the wound treated, may or may not have her leg and her arm amputated. We have to deal with that. Then we're going to see if there's any mild or moderate head injury. Then finally, years later, I'm saying, I think I've got that PTSD. All of the symptoms are there, but we are very good at coping and segmenting some of the time until we have an opportunity to address that. So concurrent treatment is important. Marital counseling. We talked about the impact on the spouse, the family, parents, not to be ignored, please. But marital counseling is not covered under TRICARE. Okay? Family counseling is, but marital counseling is different, and it is not covered. I talked about expanded research into the HBOT that's going on. I want to just briefly read from an email I got from a service member whose husband has severe PTSD and some TBI, and her requests for additional research in both hormones and sleep apnea. In recent conversations with some other caregivers, all with a spouse with chronic severe PTSD, it has come up that a lot of our guys suffer from extremely low testosterone levels. All of our other endocrine panels will be fine, but the testosterone causes, besides the obvious ones, other things to happen. The fledgling energy levels, the added body fat, and then the complication with PTSD, usually you're on medication and you want to isolate oftentimes, so without the physical exercise. So research that needs to be done, I would say testosterone and hormone levels is one of them. And then she talks about sleep apnea. And is there a quieter machine than the CPAP? Really, if there weren't testosterone issues, the whole Darth Vader look is not flattering, nor is the alternating sucking roaring sound, which may help him sleep, but it keeps everyone else awake in a 5-block radius. So there are some additional medical things that need to be done there. Emphasis on employment. Employment is not just when you're completed with rehabilitation. Employment has to be part of rehabilitation. It's a very important component, and everyone can participate, and almost everyone can participate. And then the peer-to-peer programs that I mentioned, and that Loree and I know Renee is supporting some of those. Those are very important too, especially I would say the women's groups, an opportunity for women to be together alone, spouses to be together alone, and surviving families sometimes to be together alone. I'm very grateful for the social networking that now really lets us not go around or over the walls, but we can go straight through them. And if I have a question about what it is that a surviving family needs down at Fort Benning, a friend of mine who has 4 young children following the death of her husband by suicide, I'm able to go on the, frankly, quicker online on our social networks with things like Blue Stars and National Military Family Association and find out a link for her. So I'm very grateful for that. We've come a long way, and I would just one last thing like to say that I do not agree that we need a wholesale rethinking of the system. I do not believe that frankly, that in one way we have the luxury. We cannot stop this train and theoretically design something better. We had to do it as we could, and we had to incorporate as many of the consumers, clients, our peeps as we possibly could. That's imperative to make sure we're listening to the voice of the military service member and the family. But we do have to integrate more with our community partners, with our nonprofits, and use things like the programs that Renee supports. And we need to implement the things that Loree was talking about in terms of a cultural change and reach out to those civilians who don't understand the experience that our military families are having. Thank you very, very much for hosting this, and I look forward to talking to you all later.
And Renee Bardorf.
Hi, good morning. I'm just going to move this bag a little bit.
Yep.
That's okay. Thank you very much for having me this morning. I'm Renee Bardorf, and I come to you actually having worked with Dr. Davis in the past. I was one of the members of her working group that put together the case management process, an extraordinary experience. But who am I really? Right now I work to run a multi-million-dollar foundation with 2 wonderful, very passionate, committed celebrities who have been brought into our fold, Bob and Lee Woodruff. Bob of ABC News, so many of you know of his situation and his history in 2006, having been covering the story in Iraq with the Army and having encountered an explosive device like so many of our soldiers do, and was critically wounded, almost losing his life, was in a coma for over 30 days, and his family chose to use our military health care system instead of using civilian health care, and I think that's something that we really should acknowledge. Here we have a man who works for ABC and who has more money than Walt Disney World. And this family chose, instead of going to any civilian doctor that they could have on their private jets and whatever ABC was willing to give them, and they chose instead to go to Landstuhl and then to receive their treatment at Bethesda, and then move on to rehab treatment in the civilian sector, like so many of our service members do. One of the important things I think we need to acknowledge is really how far have we come. It's amazing to me that you have a better chance of living now from an explosion or an incident, a traumatic event in Balad than you actually do in Arlington, Virginia. And that's how much we've learned in our military health care system. And so many of our civilian doctors and facilities are learning so much from the lessons that we've learned in these wars. But But going back to who I am, I run this foundation, and as Loree said, and she was very, very modest, she says she has no academic credentials, but I just read her bio, and she's been to the War College. She has, she has plenty of degrees under her belt. I am taking a class at Harvard, but I certainly don't have anything like Dr. Davis's PhD. But that hasn't helped me really in this job and how to proceed with helping military families. It's helped me be a better executive director of a public charity. But what has made me understand military families is by being one for the last 18 years. I have the pleasure of having my young 14-year-old son in the back of the room with us today, who is a military brat. And I'm a mom and a sister. I'm the sister of a Marine. I'm the spouse of a Marine. I'm a daughter, a neighbor, a friend. I'm really not unlike anyone else in the civilian community, except I have this unique experience of being a part of the military family. And that's how I really got here. I started about 17 years ago working in family policy for the Marine Corps, and then starting a nonprofit in the beginning of the first phases of this war, the Injured Marine Semper Fi Fund. I was a part of that founding group, and we were very successful at raising money to bring people to the bedsides, and in doing that, we really learned where the gaps were in our care back in 2003 and 2004 in DOD and in VA. And I went back to DOD to work in family policy so that we could really take a look at what do we need to do as a government to improve our services to families. And we have come so far. It really is extraordinary how far we have come in pulling together our services and having those stovepipes and getting the services to work together. Having worked so long in the Marine Corps, I would probably beg to differ that the Marine Corps does it better than the Army does. The Marine Corps has a culture of taking care of their own. The Army is so immense, but the people at the top don't care any less than the Marines do, and nor do they in the middle or in the bottom of the ranks. It's just a more complex system to navigate, and the Reserve and the National Guard element is so complex. But there's extraordinary programs. And part of our problem, I think, within the system is that we don't do a great job of informing our families as to what is available to them, because what is available is unbelievable. And we need to do a better job at that. But let me tell you a little bit about the Bob Woodruff Foundation. It says that I'm the executive director of Remind, which is really what our public face is. If you knew Bob, you would know that he is a very modest guy, and he doesn't really want to be the face of this foundation. He wants the service member to be the face of this foundation. And what we decided was to put together a foundation that would ensure that our injured service members would come home to a home front that was ready to support them, especially as it related to the hidden injuries of war, those signature injuries of TBI and combat stress. And it's really not just PTSD. It is anxiety, depression, substance abuse. Those are really the ones that are wreaking havoc and which then move on into PTSD. We came together, and what we did is we realized, having had this experience of working in the system and then having a voice of someone who at a moment's notice could stand in front of a camera and talk to 8 million people in the United States and bridge a gap between our military family and the whole world. And what we thought was, how can we do this and do it effectively? How can we engage the American public and teach them something about us? How can we bridge that chasm between our military culture and our civilian culture? How can we keep people engaged and understanding? I mean, look in this room right now. There's so few of us, really, and this is such an important issue. there's not enough Americans in this room that care. Most of the people in this room have a reason for being here, and it's because you're either part of our family or you're doing work on behalf of our family. You're not here just because you care or you wanted to hear. And how do we do that? How do we inform neighbors? How do we get people to take action? And so our vision was really to build a movement and to empower communities outside of our circle that we have always been driven into thinking we take care of our own, and we keep ourselves insulated, and we don't reach out for help. But guess what? When a military service member, especially with a hidden injury of war, gets out of the service, it is that community that has to take care of them. We release them back into their communities where they don't have the base, and they don't have the TRICARE clinic right in the installation, and they don't have the resources that we have on the bases. So what we did is we put together a program which is really a threefold program. What we decided to do was to educate the public, and that's really where Remind comes in. Remind.org is about reminding the American public of our responsibilities as citizens of this nation to take action to ensure that our injured heroes have successful futures for the rest of their lives. Not the parade and the welcome home and the kiss hello and the waving thank you in the airport or the yellow ribbon on the back of the car. It's about successful futures. It's about a real commitment to them and ensuring that we repay the debt that they have done for us. So that is what Remind is. We also collaborate with key leaders within government and outside government, and we really work together with the Wounded Warrior programs within the services. We work with the DCoE, with Loree Sutton's folks, and we keep engaged, and we keep reminding one another how important it is that we work together. It doesn't work. Government cannot do this alone. Absolutely cannot do it alone. And then the third part of this is really investing, because we can say, and Loree can get up here, and you see how passionate she is, and you see how excited she is, and she gets in front of an audience and she moves us. But she moves us in a really special way because we get her. We get what she's saying. It doesn't always work just to say it. Just to say someone in uniform who's up here and says, you need to support these service members because you need to invest in that community. You need to go down there and talk to them, and you need to provide money. And sometimes government can't provide all the money. And so what we do is we invest in both national and community-based efforts throughout the entire country to try to fill the gaps where government does not. We don't duplicate efforts. We refer people back into the system when they should be, when those services are provided to the wounded service member. That does two things. It doesn't duplicate the tax dollars that we're already spending on this issue, and it also makes the government accountable for what they're supposed to be doing. By collaborating together with the nonprofit groups and pushing people back into a system that should be assisting them, we're doing everyone a great service. So what we've decided is that we really want to be a thought leader, an umbrella organization that helps young community organizations to take action. So we have this movement, and we're out there. We have about 10,000 followers now on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, YouTube, Our Cause. We're really looking at a younger demographic of people, peers like my son's school, who go out and they help us fundraise. They put together Remind packets and dog tags to distribute amongst young students and get them engaged. We work with the Student Veterans of America, both on their peer-to-peer programs and integrating student veterans into the university setting, and then helping civilian students understand what their peers have been through and to support them. Some of the other things that we're invested in are small things like emergency financial assistance. When there's a need, you have someone who whose mother has been at the bedside for years now in some cases and cannot afford the mortgage because she's given up her job and there's no one else to do that. On occasion, we provide assistance to those folks, or we invest in organizations that provide that assistance locally. We are looking at both the small issues and then the larger issues like substance abuse, homelessness, and suicide, and how do we, as a collaborative group, solve these issues. We are invested in things like the Military Child Education Coalition, who has developed a program to go around to communities that surround military installations like Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune, Camp Pendleton, Fort Hood. They go out into the civilian communities where we know that most of our families are living. Not everyone lives on the base and has that wonderful, supportive installation school facility, but they go outside and they teach the school counselors and educators about trauma and loss in the military family and how to cope with that. We are also invested in Operation Education, which provides a free education above and beyond what the GI Bill provides to our service members as they return to college. But what's really interesting and we're really taking a good look at is investing in programs that were not set up for the military. There are two programs that I'd like to talk to you about that are solving the bigger social issues. One of those is the Jericho Project, and I was there last night, and they are a homeless initiative in New York City. And they have a unique model in that they don't provide just shelter service. They provide long-term housing solutions. They also provide apartments, and they place family members into apartments. And what we do with our dollars is we take a look at a successful model in the civilian community, and we restrict our funds in such a way, and our grant in such a way, that they are forced to use those dollars to serve our veteran or our active duty military community. And then what we do is we go back to government and to DOD and we say, look at what we found. How do you think we can model this in another community? How can we get service members to utilize these programs? So that's a great program. Another one is the JED Foundation, which is a leader in suicide prevention in college students. And what we did is we partnered them with the Student Veterans of America. And we got them working together to address the problems of PTSD, substance abuse, depression, in students that we know are transitioning into a university setting. So, what we're doing with Remind is really about empowering civilians. It's about saying, this is not about the war, it's about the warrior. It doesn't matter what your feelings are about the war, how we got there, why we stay. We have an obligation to ensure that we take care of our service members. And I'll leave you with a quote that I know you all have heard, because it's so important, and it's so important that we remember this, because as a government, we need to remember that these conflicts are not going away. We need to continue to recruit and train and retain these young people. And we want an all-volunteer service. We don't want a draft. This is an important quote, as you've all heard from George Washington, which is, "The willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive the veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by their nation." This, to use Hillary Clinton's quote, this is an issue that takes a village. We cannot be insulated. We can't take care of our own. We have to reach out to the civilian sector. We have to empower them. We have to keep them engaged. We have to remind them that I am their sister, their daughter, their wife. I am no different than their neighbor. I just happen to be married to someone and serving our nation on their behalf. It's important that we continue to remind them that, and that we work together within government and outside to solve these issues. So thank you.
I really find it astonishing as someone who's an outsider to this process and to this reality that so much has been developed in the civilian sector in support of soldiers and their families, and in conjunction with portions of the military itself. I don't know exactly how it all developed, and probably some academic's going to write a dissertation on how the whole thing got together, and but it really is startling, and I think highly commendable and extraordinary. I'm sure there are people in the audience who would love to ask some questions, and I would welcome any hands. Yes, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Renee. Are you all, and I love what you're doing with Remind. I think it's so exciting. Are you all doing anything about kind of the fears that people have about the damaged veteran? For instance, a unit of a friend of mine was planning a reunion cruise, and the cruise company they contacted said they wanted a certification that none of the returning vets had PTSD because they were afraid of violence on the ship.
Right.
Do you guys address that?
Yes, actually, it's one of the really important messages that we have within the foundation. Part of that is really getting someone like Bob out there, ensuring that he continues to be successful as a journalist, continues to tell the stories of our military families, and reduce that stigma. There's not just stigma with receiving treatment. There's stigma on the side of civilians as to realize what is the benefit of my hiring a young man or woman with a traumatic brain injury, a cognitive injury of all that, or a psychological disorder. What is the benefit to my organization or to my community? And what we remind them certainly is that treatment can change this, and that it's important to unite around that person and provide the support. And to use Bob especially, Bob has recovered just miraculously. However, he still has aphasia, which is sort of a word retrieval issue. It's very difficult for him to do live TV. But when people hear him and they see his success, he's an example, especially because he has so much credibility in the civilian sector, of who our service members really are. And so, yes, that's part of our push, and our social movement network is really reminding people that this is what our injured service members still have to offer, and this is what you can do to support them. Sure.
I think there is a segment of society, though, that is afraid of every veteran. Mm-hmm. They're afraid that every veteran has a lurking PTSD moment that could be violent to them or violent to others. I've had people say things to me, are you afraid your husband's going to do something to you in his sleep or something like that? But that would affect anybody from hiring any vet or being associated with any vet. Do you guys address that?
Well, I think sometimes, we have to be honest. We have to be honest with employers. I'm married to a Marine just like you do, and there are times when there is an awful bad dream, and or there is a reaction that is not appropriate as we see it in their behavior. A lot of the corporations that we work with or the organizations we invest in that do employment are really honest with employers about this is what you can do to support this individual. These are the things that that can come up. I think once people feel more educated about the issues and how they can be circumvented, they're a little bit more comfortable with the situation.
Just to add, for those who aren't as familiar, very good point. A lot of people are afraid, is he or she going to go postal? You know, are the kids safe? Are my grandchildren safe anymore? You know, should we visit, etc. One of the federal programs, as you know, that's been created to do that is help with that is America's Heroes to Work. That's in the Department of Labor, and that was very much supported early on by Loree, Sutton, and others at the DoD and the VA. However, usually that is preaching to the choir in that we're talking to employers that are really inside of the military-industrial complex. They're contractors. They get incentives for hiring uniformed personnel and veterans. They know some of the language, and also they do understand that there are supports that are available. There's computer assistance technology and support for that, for cognitive problems, vision problems, etc. But we do need to do a better job of dispelling that myth, because PTSD is not by any means just a phenomenon that occurs in the military. And the associated behaviors, mine was not military related, and the associated behaviors of self-medication, etc., can happen to anybody. So we have to break that down. And frankly, the story in the Washington Times last Sunday about the warrior transition units, that doesn't help. Should it be written? Absolutely. Are there problems? Absolutely. We really need informed individuals to come forward from the civilian sector and speak about the positive experiences. It's a way there to do the MilCiv translation of what we know by letting those people in the civilian sector understand that the problems they may be having with the teenager or somebody else who's experienced a brain injury in sports can be addressed and overcome.
Let me just add to that real quick. And one of the interesting things to highlight is that I was welcome to go to the Heroes at Work program within the Department of Labor, even though I was outside of government, and they took a real effort in making sure that I understood what they were doing. And I think it's really important that organizations like ours and NMFA and many of the other great ones that are out there are using the same nomenclature as government, that we're speaking the same language, that we're consistent in our messaging. We've talked with the joint staff and with all the services about how do you want to talk about these issues, and how can we help you to reduce that stigma. The other thing that we have done that Linda sort of reminded me about is when we go to corporate sponsors to ask them for money, we don't just ask them for money for an event. We have this great event in New York where we have Bruce Springsteen come and sing, and it's a great thing for a corporate sponsor to throw their logo up on the wall and highlight that. But what we've been doing recently is really doing more of relationship building with potential corporate sponsors, where we say, not only would we like your money, but we would also like for your employees to be involved in spreading the Remind message. We would like for you to consider hiring injured veterans. We'll give you the support that you need in order to do so. We had a trader, a brokerage firm on Wall Street, it's called GFI, who was one of our biggest sponsors last year, and they brought on 3 interns. All of them were injured, and as we all know, almost everyone has an overlay of combat stress to their physical injury. And they knew that going in, and they were very supportive. And they also knew, as Linda said, that there are a lot of other people within their corporation that have substance abuse problems or that have other psychological issues. In this case, it was very successful. So again, it's about working together. Yes.
Hi, Christy Kaufman. I really appreciate what you guys are doing, particularly with the MilCiv part, because DoD is not a social service organization, and it never will be, and it shouldn't be. they can do what they can. So it's so important, and I appreciate that. Lynn, I wanted to comment on what you just brought up, the article, and was it the Post or New York Times or whatever it was?
Post, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, it was New York Times.
The New York Times?
Last Sunday, the New York Times.
Yeah. I've been doing work over with both General Cheek and the WTB Command at Walter Reed. About 6 months ago, I started going to the Malone House just as an Army spouse, doing some mentoring for the young spouses, because what we're finding is a lot of them are very young and don't really have any background in military culture, Army culture, because they get married 2 weeks before their husband deploys and their husband gets injured or wounded, and then they're coming back and they're having trouble navigating. Renee, I wanted to comment on something that you said, the awareness part. Mm-hmm. I think when I met with both General Cheek and with the command at WTB, we've gone from
it's
this
the Warrior Transition Battalion
Brigade at Walter Reed, right? So there's the WTUs. There's 36 of them or something, and Colorado was one of them. But one of the things that we've found is that in the beginning there were a lack of resources, particularly for family members. Mm-hmm. And now there is a ton of them. Mm-hmm. And the awareness piece is sometimes, whether there's not enough or there's too much, the end state is the same, which is you have a bunch of really confused young ladies running around down there.
Right.
And I know we've done a lot of work and we've shrunk it down, but when you ask some of these young girls, well, what is this person supposed to do for you? There's still a lot of confusion there. And I'm working with Command around that. But it goes back to the training piece. In the article, one of the things that came across are the NCOs and the way, particularly the squad leaders, the way they were handling certain situations. And that's what I hear a lot from the girls. So we go back to the 2-week training that they're supposed to get in San Antonio, and my question is, from all we know, particularly in the information you're getting about PTSD and TBI, like I said, my sister has a TBI, and I know that without the family support, she would not be successful in life. So in that training, what are we doing to look at that curriculum, constantly updating it with the information that you guys are getting, and then making sure they're getting the training before they come and deal with these with the service members and the family members?
I think that, in my opinion, the training has to start before the injury occurs. A lot of the training needs to occur before the deployment happens. Spouses should be encouraged to participate in activities before their husband ever even deploys. I'm not sure what the Army calls their program, but the Marine Corps has a program called LINKS, and it really is a wonderful program that helps young service member spouses get engaged and understand what the military culture is all about and what to expect and who to call. It really starts there, and we have to make a bigger commitment, I think, to bring spouses into the fold. We also have to make a bigger commitment to the service member to ensure that he includes his spouse in the information resources that occur. So I think a lot of that happens there. I think we have circumvented quite a bit with the reducing of the case managers by having now the recovery care coordinators, by having the Wounded Warrior units. It is a lot better than it was. It's not perfect. I think, to me, the more resources is as detrimental, if not more, than the lack of resources in many cases. And there's still a ways to go. But I think that what we're showing here is that if we can get more organizations, we work with NMFA ourselves, with DOD, with VA, to again be speaking the same language, the same terminology, the pushing people to the same resources, then we will get to that end. It is difficult to do, and part of the problem I have seen is that soldiers and Marines particularly are not always forthcoming with their spouses to get them involved with the command and to get them involved with receiving the information that they need in order to be successful. So we need to sort of destigmatize that with our young soldiers and Marines, that you're not going to get in trouble just because your wife is involved in these things, and we don't have to keep secrets amongst our units and our families. I just had a Marine mother-in-law who pitched a story to Bob through our website. And I knew enough as the executive director to know, usually when this happens, there's a little bit more to the story. And to make a long story short, it was a young Marine with PTSD and mild TBI and a substance abuse problem who wasn't forthcoming to his mom and his spouse. He was coming home every day late and talking about the command and not taking advantage of the resources that he had and really getting them spun up about, I'm not getting any support. And then come to find out, there were a lot of other problems going on within the unit and with this particular Marine that his wife and his mother-in-law didn't know. Had we not been tied in, we might have sort of fallen for that and taken that story right to World News Tonight and told 8 million people that the Wounded Warrior Battalion East at Camp Lejeune wasn't doing their job. And, you know, it's one of the best facilities that we have in the military. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
that's a really good example, Renee. And when we talk about the military and civilian connection and the importance of awareness and reminding the American public and engaging that many people have touched on, we want to have nonprofit organizations, communities reaching out, but we do have to recognize that they're not always going to know the right thing to do. If there is a right thing to do, and oftentimes there's not a protocol like the book, the DSM-4 that's over there. There is not a standard. We're still working our way through and finding out what works with the children who are depressed, what works with the moderate TBI coupled with the severe PTSD. And so we're still unlocking the key to right place, right time, right person, right service. And part of that is developing a quality control mechanism this now is a voluntary community. It's a nationwide effort of, especially with the social media, of groups wanting to engage, and then we say, but wait a minute, it's not necessarily the best therapeutic approach to put the individual with cognitive mental depression or schizophrenia in a peer group with a service member with severe PTSD, because there are different phenomena that they're experiencing. So there's a long challenge ahead, and I think some research and some good metrics that have to be provided to, what really does work. And I think the training that you're touching on is a very important part for our service members as well as the families. That's essential, our own in-house work.
And that training I was referring to was that 2-week
Right.
for the cadre.
Right.
They come in,
and right now, what used to happen in the Army is they used to do that when they first started the Warrior Battalion units, and they used to do that. They would bring everybody in. They'd have the 300 people together, and they'd do out at Lansdowne. I can't speak to what they're doing now, but it should be protocol for. I know it is. The Navy was going to introduce that as basic training that had to occur.
Right, but with what you guys are learning, particularly with your organization around PTSD and TBI and all the new things that are constantly coming up, because we're constantly learning new things, is there a way for that, civilian military connection, for that work or those best practices to be suggested, at least for that DoD or whatever medical
absolutely.
training?
And they are, and
Loree's
that's
doing a lot of that too.
And that's why that's why Loree and I and we're now invested in 85 groups throughout the country. We've touched more than 500,000 service members with the money that we've invested in these 85 groups. And that's why we're talking to people like Loree, and she's talking to us, and we have this dialogue. That's why, we have dinner with General Corelli, who's really working very, very hard to resolve this suicide issue. Folks are not within DoD are basically willing to try anything. They are. There is no one, I think, on this entire earth that wants the suicides to stop more than Peter Corelli does, and he will do anything to make that happen. He'll talk to anyone that will help. So this is not a neglecting thing. It is a communication and a dialogue and a learning process, and we're all still learning, but better than ever, we're working together.
And absolutely, I don't think that particularly in Army leadership there's been any neglect or malintent or anything like that. My concern has always been when we get these best practices, how can we best implement them to the line side or to the medical side without too much of a delay. I know a lot of it is a bureaucratic issue, but I've been working with Loree now for the past year, and I see all the amazing things that they're doing, and then we're on the ground and we're not quite seeing them get where they need to be, and that's just that's difficult. I realize that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's someone in the back too that was like.
And Sonia,
go ahead. Right. Yeah, she's been.
Hi, my name is Rachel Shannon, and I just, as a former Navy air crewman and someone who is a successful PTSD story, I want to thank you all very much for the activities that you do, the support you provide, in particular for the military families. God knows I wouldn't have made it without my military family. Mm-hmm. There are two particular issues I want to address, mostly from the worker bee perspective. One is for military members, I think care and diagnosis has improved quite a bit. But I could tell you that even as late as 2008 and 2009, I've had several friends coming back from Iraq. It's clear to me they have PTSD. A door shuts and they jump about a mile wide. We tried to contact, for example, the Walter Reed Center, and we spoke to the head psychologist there. This was about 2 years ago, and he did not know what EMDR treatment is, which is one of the top 3 treatments for me. Mm-hmm. It's the reason why I was able to return back. We then contacted the VA, the entire VA region. They did not have one EMDR certified therapist. They do have some ACT, which is also great therapy, some cognitive behavioral therapy. But what I've seen from just my layman's perspective is kind of a hodgepodge of diagnosis, medical treatment, people not getting correctly diagnosed. And then on the veteran side as well, especially for someone who wasn't diagnosed properly in the first place or wasn't really aware of PTSD, slipping through the cracks and not getting the proper diagnosis, either through the VA mismanning. I was one of those people that did not want to go into the VA because I had a negative experience. I was very lucky that I walked into a center 2 years after my initial event where the social worker there had PTSD and was one of the first EMDR certified therapists. So what I'd like to know is if there is an initiative to create a quality control process where if you're a veteran or you're a military member and you go to any of these organizations that are providing health care, they have a checklist of things they have to go through to see if you have PTSD and also to get an appropriate treatment plan. Because from what I can see, even though we've made a lot of initiatives, having a solid treatment plan where you actually rehabilitate a person back into the community and they find that new normal, it's still inconsistent. Mm-hmm. But thank you again for your efforts.
Well, I thank you very much. Yay, EMDR. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of different, as you said, a lot of different approaches, and we're trying those with Loree at different centers, like down in Balboa. They have the implosion therapy and different, which scare the heck out of me. But anyway, my understanding is that Secretary Shinseki, like Secretary Peake at the VA, has now mandated that they are doing, this started over a year ago, they are doing the callbacks for every single service member who has served in OEF, OI, and they are asking them a series of standard questions about their experience in terms of symptomatology so they can try to identify and bring in those who may need additional care. The women, because it was rightly noted by Loree, I believe, and some others, that you are not noted that you were in combat or in a situation when there is military sexual trauma. You are not about many times to report it. Women the other day telling me how her whole tour, she went to the bathroom in a baggie in her tent rather than go out at dark even with her peers. So we underreport. As a result, there's delayed onset and other things, but we are going back and screening. We're developing the baseline before anybody goes into theater with both your what would be your cognitive behavior as well as your emotional markers, and that we are going back through the VA and screening. And when there is a assessment of your rating for on the VA side, we are now asking a standard series of questions. Is it right? No, not yet, but I'm very pleased that they are going back and rescreening everybody else, because it needs to get done, and there's a lot of people who don't have a diagnosis, it doesn't show up, then you don't get eligible for treatment the rest of your life.
I would add to that there's a huge shortage both on the active duty side and within the VA of mental health professionals to treat people, so that even sometimes when there is a diagnosis, there can be a long wait. Also, VA now has some programs specifically for women, because particularly when there's military sexual trauma, it doesn't always work to have a co-ed group. But they are only in a few places. The waiting lists are long, and it's more money, more professionals, more help, and finding the people, as you said, and matching them up to the right kind of treatment. Yes, I'll try. It involves women and men, because it happens to probably 1% to 2% of the men also on active duty who are raped or severely sexual assaulted while serving, sometimes by the people that are their bosses. And sometimes in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, it's very difficult because they are living 24 hours a day, perhaps with the person who's assaulted them, or sometimes told them something like, you better be good to me or you're going to get all the dangerous duty, so that he says, or she's agreed to sleep with me. It wasn't, but she felt it's that kind of thing. And when that continues over time, or to a civilian rape victim, PTSD is not an uncommon thing.
And it's not just mill to mill. It can be contractor to military, a lot of different.
Yeah, or local, national.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sonia. Jennifer Middlestat, Penn State. It strikes me that you all are keeping track of so much and having to research so much right now. So I hate to ask another question that would require more research, but I'm just curious. It seems obvious, and you mentioned this, Renee, in your comments, that there's some real economic effects that soldiers and families would experience from this. And I'm wondering just if you know if anybody is keeping track of them or researching them, so we have a sense of the total effect on families and the total impact, and then ways that things might be done about it. Thank you.
Perhaps Joyce would be. We've got our two experts in the back room. I'm going to punt to the family one, but yes, there is research being done. It's being done a lot by extrapolation, of course, because it's one cost when you're in the military, and then it's another cost when you transfer to the civilian sector. We have estimates of the, per patient cost of treatment and foregone treatment when you do not care for the TBI or the PTSD appropriately, because oftentimes it will resolve with certain treatments that were mentioned, like the EMDR. But if you don't do that for a cost of X thousands, the loss of the job earnings income over the lifetime is into the tens of hundreds of thousands. And so we do have that work that's being done. I think AID and RAND and some other ones. And if you needed to, we'd be happy to work with Sonia to track those down.
Well, and that's something that we're talking to communities about, and reasons why you should care. I mean, there's a reason to care because it's the right thing to do, but there's also a reason to care because, one, the cost to society in the long run is going to be enormous if we don't take action to resolve some of these issues early on and ensure that they have successful futures. These are social issues that our citizens should care about. And the other thing they should care about, especially if they're not in agreement with the war and what brought us there and what keeps us there, is that our children serve so yours don't. We'd all prefer that everyone have a choice to do that. And so much more subtly, when we are talking about reminding our citizens about their obligations to our service members, we're talking about that. We're talking about the cost to them, to all of us, and we're talking about the cost to their family, potentially.
And there's also the Department of Labor, as opposed to the Department of Veterans Affairs, which runs the Veterans Employment and Training Service, which is trying to develop programs, many of them which are with communities, to train and equip people with TBI or PTSD to return to the civilian employment. But I'm not sure how successful some of those programs are for a lot of reasons.
Joyce?
Well, we do know that unemployment rates for Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans are higher than the civilian rate, and so that is a concern. Another concern when we talk about wounded and injured veterans is what's the family earning power, and often, you know, when these folks get out of the military, there are a lot of programs to support training for the veteran, but maybe the veteran can't work, and we need to also focus on training and education for the spouse who's now become the primary caregiver, the primary breadwinner. And so a lot of us have worked very hard to get the caregiver legislation that was just made it through Congress to help compensate caregivers and provide some income when they can't work because they're taking care of the veteran. But in many other cases, we need to look at how to help that caregiver, that spouse, contribute to the family income when the veteran maybe can't. So we have to treat this holistically and look at the family, not just the veteran.
Sonia, last word?
No, the last word is let's go to lunch.
Okay. I very much want to thank the panel. I want to just quote Renee. One sentence of hers was, "These conflicts are not going away." And that's certainly, unfortunately, the case. It's actually been the case throughout history. The bad news is that these injuries have occurred throughout history, and maybe we'll hear more from Nancy Sherman about these things. People have been wounded, but the good news is that there have been improvements in treatment. Most of those improvements have been in the physical sphere, in surgery, and this is just in the past century, in infectious disease control, brain injuries, certainly in the last years, and psychological industries. Psychological damage has been. There was a while when it was denied that it actually occurred, and or just swept aside, and it's been increasingly recognized, even to the point that the questioner asked, all veterans are assumed to have it, and there's an enormous stigma related to that. So this is a dynamic situation. But I think the good news is that there is a greater and greater focus on these kinds of injuries and a greater and greater expertise in treating not only them, but also an increasing ongoing expertise in treating traumatic injuries of all sorts. So I'm all that stands between you and lunch, and I'm all that stands between you and Professor Sherman. So thank you very much, and please thank the panel.